On a decisive morning in 490 BC, Greece faced an enemy that seemed unbeatable, the mighty Persian army. Yet at Marathon, a handful of Greek warriors, armed with courage and strategy, turned the impossible into reality. What seemed like the end of Greek freedom became one of the most remarkable victories in history, proving that unity and determination can bring down even the greatest empires. Imagine with me, the sun was burning hot on that September morning in the year 490 before Christ. On one side of the plain near the sea stood an enormous army, so vast that people said their arrows could darken the sky. They were the Persians, the most powerful people of that time, with an empire stretching from Egypt to India. Their message was very clear: either you obey or we destroy everything. Before we dive into the second topic, I'd like to ask you a small favor. Take a moment to check if you're already subscribed to the channel. This is super important because in the upcoming videos, we'll have a series of amazing content that will help you gain a deeper understanding of the empire's domains. On the other side were just over 10,000 Greeks, coming from Athens and a small city called Plataea. They weren't many, but they carried bronze shields, sharp spears, and above all, courage. They knew this wasn't just another skirmish over land. It was a decisive moment, something that could change forever the future of the world we know today. There, on the field of Marathon, the Greeks weren't only defending their cities. They were fighting for their very freedom against an enemy that seemed impossible to defeat. And what happened in that place was so extraordinary that the story of this battle continued to be told for more than 2,000 years. It all began far from the battlefield. Imagine a huge palace made of shining marble in a city called Persepolis. There, sitting on a majestic throne, was King Darius I. He wasn't just any king. He ruled the largest empire the world had ever seen, spread across 3 continents. His soldiers had never lost a war, and his treasure chests were so full of riches that they seemed endless. But even with all that power, Darius had one concern that wouldn't leave his mind: the small cities of Greece. They were cities full of quarrels among themselves, but they had done something unforgivable in the eyes of the king. They dared to defy him. This story began a few years earlier, when the Greek cities of Ionia, located in what is now Turkey, decided to rebel against the Persians. Darius believed it would be easy to crush this revolt. However, something unexpected happened. Athens and 2 other Greek cities chose to help, sending soldiers and ships to support the Ionians. Even so, the Persians managed to win in the famous Battle of Lade in the year 494 BC. But the king never forgot the boldness of the Athenians. It was then that the seeds of the future Battle of Marathon were planted. Think about it. King Darius could hardly believe what had happened. How could those small, quarrelsome Greek cities dare to meddle in my affairs, he must have thought. How did they have the courage to support a rebellion against me, the King of Kings? Filled with rage, he began to plan his revenge with the same calm and organization with which he had built his vast empire. In the year 491 BC, Darius sent messengers throughout Greece with a clear demand. He wanted earth and water. These 2 symbols meant that a city accepted submission to Persian rule. And most of the smaller cities, terrified of Darius's wrath, obeyed without protest. But 2 cities decided to defy the greatest empire in the world, Athens and Sparta. Instead of accepting his order, they threw the Persian messengers into pits and wells. It was such a bold and provocative act that the message was clear: war was now inevitable. Darius wasted no time. He began gathering an impressive military force, unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Some ancient sources claimed it was hundreds of thousands of soldiers, but modern historians estimate it was between 20,000 and 25,000 men. Even so, it was still a massive army, made up of warriors from across the empire. Among them were the famous Persian immortals, dressed in embroidered tunics, carrying powerful bows, and wearing armor that looked like fish scales. There were also Median cavalrymen, swift archers from the Great Plains, and Phoenician sailors, masters of naval warfare. All this strength was placed under the command of 2 generals in whom Darius trusted completely. Look At the head of this gigantic army were two commanders trusted by King Darius. The first was Artaphernus, the king's own nephew, an experienced man who had already dealt with several rebellions. Beside him was Datus, a Median nobleman famous for being extremely efficient and harsh. Together, they didn't just lead soldiers, but also a true floating city. A fleet of 600 triremes, the most advanced warships of that time, cutting through the dark waters of the Aegean Sea, carrying all the Persian might. Their plan was simple and straightforward. First, conquer the Cyclades Islands, which were important strategic points. Then attack the first city that had dared to help in the revolt against the Persians, to make it clear what happened to anyone who meddled in the affairs of the King of Kings. And finally, march to Athens, destroy its newborn democracy, and restore Hippias, a former tyrant who had fled to live under Persian protection, to power. This wasn't just a war. It was a campaign of punishment, a lesson to show all Greeks the heavy price of defying the empire. The Persian fleet advanced across the sea like a swarm of locusts, and island after island surrendered without even trying to fight, terrified by the size of the approaching force. But when the Persians reached the city of Eretria, they found resistance. The defenders fought bravely for 6 whole days, until the betrayal of a few opened the gates and delivered the city to the enemy. The Persians showed no mercy in Eretria. They looted everything, enslaved the people, and burned the temples until nothing but ashes remained. The message was clear. Any city that dared to defy the King of Kings would meet the same fate. With Eretria destroyed, the Persian generals turned their eyes to the real prize, Athens. But there was an important question. Where could such a massive army land? The answer was Marathon, a wide plain about 42 kilometers from Athens. The spot was perfect. The flat terrain allowed cavalry to move easily, and the bay offered ideal space to anchor the entire fleet. On top of that, there was a symbolic detail. Decades earlier, it was in this very place that Hippias's father had landed to seize power in Athens. As the Persian ships anchored and soldiers began to disembark, messengers rushed desperately toward Athens. The city that had dared to challenge the great empire was about to face its greatest test. When the news arrived, it struck the city like a thunderclap. Eretria was in ruins, and now the Persians were only a day's march from the Athenian gates. In the agora, the central square, groups of citizens gathered with faces full of fear and despair. Some whispered that they should have surrendered when they had the chance. Others spoke of fleeing to the mountains or abandoning the city altogether to seek refuge in distant lands. But amid the chaos, a firm voice rose and changed everything. Miltiades. He was no ordinary general. He had once served in Darius's own army during the campaign against the Scythians, and because of that, he knew the Persian war machine better than anyone, its strengths, its tactics, and most importantly, its weaknesses. He was the right mind to lead Athens in its darkest hour. When Miltiades spoke, everyone stopped to listen. His words blazed like fire. Athens would not flee. Athens would not surrender. Athens would fight. But not everyone agreed. Among the 10 generals who commanded the Athenians, there was heated debate. Some wanted to hide behind the city walls and wait for reinforcements from Sparta. Others thought about negotiating, perhaps paying tribute to buy time and keep some freedom. Miltiades, however, refused all of that. He defended the boldest idea of all: leave Athens, march to Marathon, and face the Persians head-on in open battle. The debate went on for hours, voices rising, opinions clashing, until the decisive vote was called. That vote belonged to Callimachus, the Polemarch, the highest military authority in the city. And in that moment, Athenian democracy revealed its strength. A single vote would decide the fate of an entire civilization. Callimachus sided with Miltiades. Athens would go to war. Suddenly, the whole city turned into a beehive of activity. The Hoplites, citizen soldiers, gathered in each district. They were not professional warriors, but merchants, farmers, ordinary men who had trained since youth to defend their city when the moment came. They wore linen cuirasses sewn by their wives, carried wooden spears inherited from their fathers, and bronze shields passed down from generation to generation. They were 9,000 strong, carrying not just weapons, but also the pride and hope of Athens. Meanwhile, a lone figure was racing along the dusty stone paths of the mountains. Philippides, the best long-distance runner in the city. He held in his hands the most difficult mission of his life, to cover about 240 kilometers to Sparta in just 2 days and beg the Spartan warriors for help. Each step he took seemed to carry the weight of all Athens. His chest burned, his breath scorched, but he did not stop. He knew time was short, and that even with all his courage, help might still come too late. The Spartans did receive the call for help, but there was a problem. They were in the middle of the sacred festival of the Carnea, a celebration dedicated to the god Apollo. And by their religious laws, no soldier could march to war until the full moon. In other words, Athens would have to face the Persians almost entirely alone. But not all was lost. A small spark of hope appeared when the city of Plataea, a loyal friend of the Athenians, sent 1,000 warriors to fight by their side. That dawn, before the sun had risen, the Athenian army gathered. The sight was enough to give chills. Ordinary men, yet full of courage, ready to defend their freedom. They had no matching uniforms, no standardized weapons. Some held old shields inherited from their grandfathers. Others carried newly forged spears, made in haste just days before. What united them wasn't their equipment, but the reason they stood there, to fight for their freedom, for democracy, to avoid living under the tyranny of a foreign king. At their front stood Miltiades. His gaze was firm, heavy with determination. He had spent the whole night awake, studying every detail of the Marathon plain, analyzing reports, trying to turn an impossible situation into a chance for victory. And impossible it seemed indeed. The Persians were more than double the Greek numbers, with a terrifying cavalry capable of cutting through soldiers with speed and force, and archers who could fill the sky with arrows before the Athenians could even get close. By the normal calculations of war, it should have ended in massacre. But Miltiades saw what few could. Every advantage could also be turned into a weakness. The open plain of Marathon, so favorable to Persian cavalry, was bordered by marshes on one side and steep hills on the other. If the Greeks used the terrain wisely, they could block the enemy horses from advancing. What seemed like an advantage for the empire could actually become a deadly trap. And then, as the sun rose over the horizon, the two forces finally stood face to face. On one side, the massive and colorful army of Persia. On the other, the Athenians and their allies, steady and ready to fight to the very end. The contrast was so overwhelming that just looking at it was enough to inspire fear. The Persian army looked like a shining ocean spread across the plain, colorful banners waving in the wind, row after row of soldiers like rolling waves, and the cavalry trotting on the flanks like schools of fish moving in perfect sync. The pounding of hooves raised clouds of dust, and when the sun struck their lances and shields, everything sparkled like jewels scattered on the ground. On the other side, the Greeks were arranged very differently. Instead of a sea of men, there was a shorter line just enough, but made of bronze shields that side by side formed a gleaming wall. To anyone watching, that line looked small compared to the Persian mass. Some young hoplites trembled inside at the sight of so many enemies. Never before had the Greeks faced such a vast army in an open field battle. Never before had so much depended on so few. For 4 whole days, the two armies stood there, staring at one another in a deadly waiting game. No one wanted to strike first. The Persians hoped the Greeks would charge forward. Then they could fill the air with arrows and unleash their cavalry to crush everything. The Greeks, on the other hand, wanted to hold their ground and wait for the Spartans to arrive. Those days of waiting left everyone on edge. Soldiers sharpened swords that were already sharp, checked belts and cuirasses for the 10th time, and gazed at the sky as if trying to read the future. It was in that tense silence that Miltiades, the Athenian leader, crafted a plan that seemed insane, but would turn out to be exactly what saved his people. Miltiades calmly studied the Persian formation. In the center were their best troops, Persian soldiers and Scythians from the steppes, strong and well-trained men. On the flanks, at the edges of the line, stood the empire's allies, conquered peoples, not as reliable and not as well-armed. Miltiades saw an opportunity there. If those wings were pressed hard enough, they might break or even flee. So he conceived something that left his fellow generals doubtful. Instead of keeping the center strong, as anyone else would, he would deliberately weaken it. He would stretch the Greek line to match the Persian front, making the Athenian center appear weaker. But on the flanks, where his best troops stood, he would concentrate his greatest strength. When the battle began, the Greek center could bend, perhaps even fall back, while the strong wings crushed the Persian flanks. It was a risky plan, almost like betting everything on a single move. If it worked, the Persian flanks would collapse and the rest would follow. If it failed, the Greek center could be destroyed. But Miltiades knew the terrain and the makeup of both armies could be turned into an advantage if used wisely. He transformed what seemed like a weakness, the small Greek line, into a weapon through strategy and courage. As the sun began to heat the battlefield, both armies prepared. At the heart of the Greeks, the modest formation gleamed like a bronze wall. There, each man carried more than weapons. They carried family history, shields passed down as heirlooms, spears handed from father to son. They were fighting for something they understood deep in their hearts, the freedom to decide their own lives. The tension rose, the wind whipped through the banners, and everything was ready for the moment when Miltiades' plan would be tested. What looked like a fragile line was, in truth, about to become an invisible trap, and courage, guided by a brilliant idea, was preparing to astonish the world. Miltiades had a plan that went against everything the Greeks believed about how to fight. For generations, Hoplites had marched in deep, solid blocks, built to crush the enemy with sheer weight and force. But he wanted the opposite, to risk weakening the center and bet everything on boldness. It was a move that could bring victory, or destroy Athens once and for all. When he explained his idea to the other generals, many thought, he's gone mad. But some realized there was a spark of genius hidden in that madness. The chance came on the 5th day. Suddenly, scouts saw the Persian cavalry leaving the field. Perhaps they had been called to another mission. Perhaps they were just giving their horses water. It didn't matter. That absence was the opening Miltiades had been waiting for. Without their feared horsemen, the Persians would have to fight only on foot as infantry. That stripped them of one of their greatest advantages. Miltiades knew it was now or never. Then, 10,000 voices rose together. The Greek war cry thundered across the plain, powerful enough to send shivers down the spines of seasoned Persian veterans, men who had conquered half the known world. Never before had they faced an enemy so determined, so willing to defy the impossible. As the Greek phalanx began to advance, the Persian archers drew their bows. The arrows were ready to fall like rain, just as they had destroyed so many armies before. But then something unprecedented happened. Instead of marching slowly, as armies had done for centuries, the Greeks began to run. The sight left the Persian commanders stunned. They're insane, they must have thought. They'll arrive exhausted and disorganized, easy to destroy. But no, the phalanx did not break. The bronze shields stayed locked together, side by side, spears pointed forward, and the war cry only grew louder with each step. It was as if a wave of metal and courage was about to crash down and swallow the enemy whole. The Persian arrows fell in black clouds, whistling through the air like a deadly rain. They struck with such force that the Greek shields were covered with feathers, looking like porcupines. Men stumbled and fell, but the line did not break. The Greeks knew, from bitter experience, that standing still meant certain death. The only chance was to run and break through the storm as fast as possible. Better to arrive exhausted than to be turned into a target. And then came the clash. When the two lines finally met, the impact was so fierce it seemed to shake the earth itself. The sound of bronze against bronze thundered across the plain. Spears pierced gaps in armor, shields splintered under the weight of the charge, and men grappled in deadly hand-to-hand combat. The Persian front, caught off guard by the speed of the charge, began to falter, and the battle split into 3 parts, exactly as Miltiades had predicted. On the Greek right wing, the tribe of Ajax surged forward like a furious tide. Their bronze-tipped spears punched through Persian shields as if they were rotten wood. Many Persians on that flank, conscripts from conquered peoples, could not withstand the brutal close-quarters fighting. Soon, they began to fall back in disorder. On the opposite side, the warriors of Plataea fought as if the future of their families depended on every strike, and it truly did. They were fewer, but they had twice the courage. Their captain, Aramnestus, led from the front, sword in hand, cutting a path through the enemy ranks. The Persian left flank, already shaken, could no longer hold and started to collapse. But in the center, the situation was different. The Greek line, thinner and less deep, was under immense pressure from the best troops the empire had. The Immortals, Persia's elite, alongside the disciplined and ruthless Scythian warriors. Their long spears struck the Hoplites before they could counterattack, and their arrows tore gaps into the phalanx. Step by step, the Athenians were forced backward. From high vantage points, the Persian commanders smiled confidently. To them, victory seemed close. Their troops were breaking the Greek center, splitting the enemy army in two. Soon, the Greeks would be surrounded and routed. But what they didn't know was that this retreat was part of the plan. Holding the center were Aristides, who would one day become one of Athens' great leaders, and the young Themistocles, the future naval hero. They commanded with resolve, reminding their men of their role. Hold the line, even while retreating, to buy time. They were the anvil, and the wings would be the hammer. Every step backward, every life lost, was another piece of the trap being set. Then came the decisive moment. The Persian center, confident, pressed forward in pursuit. But suddenly, they realized the danger. They were isolated. Their flanks had crumbled, and the victorious Greek wings now swung inward, closing like the jaws of a beast. Behind them, their own fleeing soldiers blocked any retreat. To the left and right, the Greek wall of shields pressed inward, bronze spears gleaming in the afternoon sun. And ahead, the Greek center that had seemed broken stopped falling back, regrouped, and with a roar, launched the counterattack. Now let's move on to the next topic. But before that, I noticed you haven't left your like yet. This is super important because it helps YouTube keep recommending our videos to you. And that way we can continue bringing content that will help you. So go ahead and hit that like button. It's free and makes all the difference. Thank you. The Persians were trapped. There was no escape. What followed was not an ordinary battle, but a true slaughter. That army, which had once conquered vast lands like Egypt and Babylon, was now packed so tightly into the battlefield that they could barely raise their weapons. Then the Greek plan snapped shut like a trap. From three sides at once, bronze spears found their targets. The result was brutal. Before the sun had set, more than 6,400 Persians lay dead, while the Greeks had lost only 192 men. The survivors panicked, fleeing toward their ships, dropping their weapons, banners, and even wounded comrades along the way in a desperate attempt to escape. But Miltiades gave them no respite. He knew the Persian fleet might try to sail around Cape Saunion to strike directly at Athens. So even exhausted, the Greek warriors marched back to the city in just a single day. When the Persian ships appeared off the coast of Phaleron, they found the same wall of bronze shields that had defeated them at Marathon waiting on the shore. There, the Persian dream of conquering Greece came to an end. More than just a military victory, it was proof to the whole world. Unity and courage can defeat even the mightiest empires. On that plain at Marathon, 10,000 Greeks showed that sometimes, just sometimes, the weak can overcome the giant, and that the story of David versus Goliath can indeed come true. And so, the Battle of Marathon was not just a clash between two armies, but a turning point that changed the course of history. It showed the world that courage, strategy, and unity can turn the impossible into victory. This episode continues to echo even today as a symbol of resistance and resilience. If you've made it this far, it proves you enjoy diving into epic and meaningful stories. So, how about strengthening this community? Subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss the next videos. Don't forget to hit the like button because it helps YouTube recommend this content to more people who are passionate about history just like you. And tell me in the comments, what impressed you the most about the Battle of Marathon? Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next video, where we'll explore another fascinating chapter of the empire.